We are going to welcome up Gabriella and Jack, and we are going to look at the creative potential of podcast advertising. Don't know why I said it like that, but please give them a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much all for joining.
Thanks for coming.
I was going to say this was the post-lunch graveyard slot, but I might change that to Glastonbury headliners.
Hell yeah.
Taylor Swift, eat your heart out, although she hasn't done it, has she? Yes, thank you so much all for joining us here today. We are Gabby and Jack, as just been introduced to you, and we're here to take you beyond the platform with podcasting. So thank you all for joining us, as I said. We will take you through who we are, what bit more about podcasts. We've got 15 minutes with you, so just to let you know who we are. I'm Gabby, Group Business Director, working across Omnicom, Dentsu, Bicycle. Jack's our Global Head of Creative as well, so hopefully I can see a lot of familiar faces in the room. We've worked with a few of you already. Whilst you're here with us today, hopefully you're in the market for a podcast recommendation. So I'm currently listening to Political Currency, believe it or not, the Rise of the Dadcast podcast, most definitely, but it's both traumatic and insightful in equal measure, with host George Osborne and Ed Balls sitting down with Michael Gove to discuss that absolute shit show that was Brexit. What about you, Jack?
We've got some really highbrow choices. I'm listening to Who Trolled Amber. I love investigative journalism. One of the best places to find that in the UK podcast space is the guys at Tortoise have got an amazing newsroom. It's all about the online hate campaign against Amber Heard during her trial with Johnny Depp. It'll make you really, really angry, which I think is an underrated quality in a podcast, so I highly encourage listening to it.
We aren't always so highbrow.
No, I think we're quite out of step with the rest of us.
We're just showing off. Who are we? Acast. I'm not going to talk you through this in too much detail, but it'd be remiss of me not to mention it, but we are the home of podcasting, and that was cemented just last week, with Podtrac showing us as global #1 when it comes to podcasting worldwide. And we look after over 100,000 podcasts now, working with 2,700 advertisers and in 15 markets globally worldwide. Hopefully you'll know by now that we were the pioneers of dynamic ad insertion, and we've also championed the open ecosystem for our creators, audiences, and brands alike. And ultimately, we're here at the constant evolution of podcasts, whether it's internally for our podcasts and also for brands and creators that hopefully some of you in the room represent today. So podcasts themselves are absolutely evolving the cultural conversation, but how did we get here? What I should probably say is that it's actually our 10th birthday month this month. Happy birthday us next week. And I suppose, I don't know about you, but a birthday is very much a time of reflection, where you've come from, where you want to be. And I suppose there's no better time for us to take you beyond the platform with a quick look back at how we got here. So, as you can see from the screens around you, we believe massively in this power of storytelling, and this one starts in 2004, when podcast and the term was coined by Guardian journalists, as hopefully you'll all know. Since then, there have been any number of milestones in the podcasting space, with Ricky Gervais hitting the most downloaded podcasts, Apple entering the arena in 2012 by releasing their app, which is still one of the most used platforms to listen to podcasts today, the launch of Serial in 2014, which was probably most people in the room's gateway podcast, and more recently, the absolute explosion and evolution of podcast advertising, amplified by the pandemic, but equally also moving into things like effective measurement and also beyond the platform, as we'll see. And so too, as the kind of landscape that we find ourselves in has evolved, so too have podcasts themselves. They're completely sought out, on-demand content, and they're really at the heart of cultural conversation. And I advise anyone who's an Arsenal or Man City fan to close your ears now. The best way of showing that is how reactive they've been to last night's Champions League defeats for both those English teams. Farewell us in the Champions League. They're also all over the coverage of a very unique situation with over 64 countries going to the polls worldwide this year. But not only are they reactive to the headlines, they're creating them as well. So whether it's deep dives into the cost of living crisis, which none of us can escape, or looking at the AI world, which is definitely one of the bingo cards I wish I'd picked up today from what I've heard from some of the panels, with The Guardian's Black Box podcast too. And so too, as that market and the content is evolved, has the opportunity for audiences and brands in the consumption and engagement with podcasts beyond the platform, which Jack will talk you through in more detail from a campaign point of view. No longer a podcast just audio. You can say goodbye to your iPod Nano. You're not just going to your local Greggs, but you're seeing your favorite podcasters in your local Greggs. They're selling out arenas. They're all over your social media feeds, whether it's YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, whatever your platform, you'll find a podcaster on it as part of their ecosystem. And we know that audiences really want brands to follow suit too. They believe, from research we've seen, that 79% say that their purchase decisions will be affected by both online and offline experiences. So I'm going to hand to Jack shortly to talk you through what that looks like from a campaign evolution point of view, but have a look at this first to whet your appetite.
Okay, so that was a very short snapshot of some of the campaigns that we've put live over the last year or so. And as you would have seen, many of those are more than just audio. They're not just campaigns that be consumed on podcast platforms. There's all manner of different types of activations that are going on there. So as you've heard from Gabby, what we're going to talk about today, what we're going to dive into briefly is the modern nature of podcasting campaigns, which are very much going beyond the platform. So podcast platforms, most of us today probably use one, be it Spotify or Apple or any manner of podcatchers, to listen to an audio version of a podcast. When I joined Acast to lead the creative team about 5 years ago, I'd say 95% of the campaigns we did were just rooted in audio, wholly served and consumed and designed on podcast platforms. But nowadays, that's a very, very different case. Obviously, the whole ecosystem around podcasting has massively changed. So in order to go beyond the platform, you first need to go into the podcast ecosystem and really understand what it looks like, what it sounds like. If you're going to create an effective campaign as an advertiser and want to work with the best creators out there, it's really important to understand this ecosystem, know how to find your audience in it and how to best deliver messages. Over the last 3 years in particular, we've seen a whole new wave of creators come into the space. Some of the faces you can see on screen there, they've brought with them new audiences and also followings on different platforms, different channels, which has completely changed the nature of the podcast space. But what do we mean by the ecosystem and why is it so important to understand it if you want to advertise and effectively communicate within it? What we'll do is take a look at that ecosystem and then show you a couple best-in-class examples of how you can activate within it. So it all began with a humble RSS feed. I was telling somebody in the office earlier this morning, actually, in 2005, I was at university studying a journalism degree. I did a podcast module. I had to put the podcast live. I used an RSS feed 20 years ago to do that, and the technology hasn't really changed. That's always been an ever-present. But over the years, it's been joined by many, many other elements. So live podcasting is probably the first thing that changed the space. Again, this isn't something new. People have been doing live podcast recordings for many, many years. But now we also see podcast festivals. We see shows sell out the Royal Albert Hall and the O2. We see creators stream content online and charge audiences for that. And that was soon followed by social and video coming into the space. So we're all very much familiar, I'm sure, with the notion of seeing a clip from a podcast episode on Instagram or TikTok or watching a full episode on YouTube. TikTok in particular has completely revolutionized the space over the last 2 years. The number of Gen Z listeners and creators that have come into the space have been primarily fueled by the rise of TikTok. So it's had a massively, overwhelmingly positive impact on the podcast ecosystem. This has then led to audiences being hugely bolstered, and the way that many podcasts take advantage of that and harness the power of those audiences is through online hubs. So a great place to really develop your communities around shows. So that could be a website, it could be an app, it could be a membership portal. All of that love and those communities around podcasts have led to podcast brands really becoming center stage. So if you're a major podcast now, you've probably got a book deal, you've probably got your own merch line, and you have all these sorts of experiences that are built around the podcast brands. People go to Crouchfest, they go to Happy Place Festival. If there's a way to communicate with your brand and get in touch with it, then people want to know about it, which has then led to TV series, spawned by podcasts, IP being sold to film companies, conferences where people talk about podcast ecosystems. It's obviously a very vibrant space. So this is the ecosystem as we see it at the moment. And if you're going to effectively use it to communicate your message to an audience and work with creators, it's important to understand how best to do that for your brand. So what we'll do now is take a look at 2 examples of how we've done that to date. And we'll begin with live podcasting. I'm not a massive fan of a lot of live podcasting. I think it can be quite formulaic at times, and often shows would fall into the trap of just trying to replicate the audio version of a podcast. But why would you do that when you're in a room with people? You can do something a bit more interesting with their precious time. So hopefully, as you'll see, a great example of how to do that is a campaign we created for Law called the Secret Podcast Experience. So Law are a premium coffee brand. They really wanted to create a set of events which spoke to a 25 to 40-year-old audience and bolstered their premium credentials. So how we did that was by creating the Secret Podcast Experience brand, getting a collection of shows to host secret events at venues across London with secret guests. We had the likes of Table Manners and Talk Art and White Wine Question Time taking part. Listeners were told through audio versions of the podcast to go to a landing page to sign up for tickets. Over 39,000 people did that. We sold out the shows in a couple of minutes. We held 3 events. These events, we really played with the format of the podcast, so it wasn't the same format as if you'd have pressed play and listened to it on a podcast platform. We had lots of audience engagement, and because we had people in the room, Russ, we were able to engage all of their senses. So we had a chef create a menu based on Law's coffee blends. We had cocktails, we had coffees, we had art on the wall, we had a soundscape as you walked in. So it was a whole 3-hour experience built around a live podcast at the center of it with a secret guest. The upshot of this was that we were able to create assets that were then seeded out across social and podcast feed for months after the campaign first went live, with some really strong engagement rates, as you would have seen them. We played with the format of the show, so lots of audience engagement. We engaged all the senses and really made it a whole 3-hour experience built around the podcast, showcasing the talent and speaking to the brand values. So that's how we did it in the live space. I'll now hand you over to Gabby to talk about social and video.
Thank you very much, Jack. Yeah, Law is absolutely incredible and didn't come without its issues. I think the Queen died on the original day of recording, didn't she, of White Wine Question Time, which for understandable reasons couldn't then go ahead. But yeah, obviously that is how it kind of comes to working with these sorts of campaigns. And we've got a brand partnership team and a brilliant Acast creative team as well in-house that are kind of there with you every step of the way. So when it comes to working with us, it should be a hopefully seamless experience. But yes, as Jack said, I'm going to take you through a campaign from another global brand, from Meta, but this time specifically WhatsApp, which I'm sure needs no introduction for any of you in the room, who we worked with last summer with Spark Foundry and the client to create Behind the Lock. The team wanted to create cut-through of some of WhatsApp's privacy and innovation messaging, which doesn't immediately sound very fun or very sexy, I appreciate, but we found a way. The team trusted us implicitly with creative workshops, with finessing of the idea, and with pitch processes to create this campaign which had fun and gamification at its heart. The content that created was centered around all of our hosts having that kind of lift the lid conversation on their private WhatsApp conversations through a series of really fun games. We had people like Peter Crouch and Abby Clancy, Sorrel and Candice from Closet Confessions, and the Shits and Gigs guys, all kind of deep diving into each other's messages. So we were able to both entertain and educate simultaneously, which was really exciting. The content itself was released on the creative feeds, the RSS feeds that Jack's just mentioned, as well as a bespoke WhatsApp one too. But what was perhaps key to some of the success here was that we were able to play into the genuine and authentic nature of podcasting and creating viral clips for social feeds that kind of were sympathetic to the tone of the feed themselves. And you can see here Peter and Abby stitching each other right up. Hopefully.
Okay, so I'm sending a message. Okay, so I'm sending a message. Very important. Okay, so I'm sending a message to an
That's not playing how I want it to, so I'm going to skip over it. But essentially, Peter sent a message to Abby's producers of her new TV show, stitching her right up, saying she absolutely hated it, thought it was a shambles and didn't want to take part in it anymore. And as you can probably imagine, hilarity ensues. It absolutely blew up, as you can see. We had over 480,000 listens to episodes across all of these. Huge amounts of bespoke assets were created. As I said, this is no mean feat to take on a challenge and a campaign like this, but it was a brilliant experience for all involved, I'd like to think. Dwell time with each episode was super high, 82% in terms of listen through rate, and the views across social were absolutely huge. That kind of lifting the lid nature of what we did meant that people really engaged on social, and Usain Bolt actually liked the post from James and Fuhad from Shits and Gig there, so that's pretty good going. And then finally from me, before we wrap up, with 34 seconds to go, the key takeaways from this one, I think it was about trust. The process, trust in Acast, trust in the agency as well. From a brand like WhatsApp, obviously there's safety features and brand safety to consider at the heart too. But also trust from our creators. They let us kind of go deep dive into their world, which is what podcasts are all about, ultimately. We also added value to the listeners and the audience themselves because they are obsessed by these people. They are their communities. They want to know everything about their favorite pods, and they found that out through this campaign. And finally, communities got involved, sharing voice notes, sending in ideas for games, things like that. So it was a real community-focused campaign. That's enough from me and Jack. Thank you so much for coming, and we will see you out there.
Thank you.